And now chapter 24 of The Last Boy on Earth, The King of Pain. "I think you'd better brace for the worst," whispered the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. Somehow the old paperback had remained in Brady's pocket when he had lost everything else to the machinations of the were-dog's assault the previous night. He was glad he had pocketed Joe's dog-eared copy of the book. At least he knew that it didn't matter which actual book he held, as long as it was a faithful copy of Ben's actual writing. "I think my arm's broken," Brady replied in a nearly silent voice. He knew he was in a frightfully bad situation that promised little hope of escape. "Well, if you're going through hell, keep going," said Franklin. "Winston Churchill told me that once when they shelved me in the wrong place. It's always darkest before the dawn, Brady." "Well, it's pretty dark," Brady said, describing his situation. His body was chained to a small stone tower near the back entrance of Mount Hope Cemetery. The chains were long and ponderous, and wrapped around the entire structure 3 times, securing Brady quite soundly against the stone battlement in a crisscross pattern. Above him, on the small castle, was a defunct cannon pointing toward the sky, and under it, in stone, were chiseled the numbers 1861, 1865. He had barely been conscious when Grundle and Fenris chained him just before full daybreak. Now that the sun was rising, he was roused by the light and its warmth, only to find himself held captive. He was Prometheus, bound on the rocky mountain, waiting for the eagle. "It must have been quite a journey last night. You fought bravely, I'm sure. Sorry I couldn't be of any assistance," said Ben quietly. "It's okay," grunted Brady, struggling against his bonds. "What do you see? Where are we?" asked the autobiography. Brady knew where they were, although why Grundle chose this place was a mystery to him. "We're in Mount Hope Cemetery, chained to the Civil War Memorial Tower. I can't move." "Well, don't struggle. You'll only do more damage to yourself. Are we alone?" Brady looked around as far as he could see. "I think so. All alone. Not a were-dog or monster to be seen." "There won't be there until darkness falls. Grendel might come during the daylight, but those foul creatures do most of their dealings after nightfall. They'll wait at least until twilight." "Why didn't he kill me last night?" wondered Brady aloud. "Perhaps he wants you to be conscious when he destroys you," ventured Ben. "Or he wants Kaylee and Joe to find their way to me and kill us all in one shot." "Yes, that's a possibility," replied Ben. "Actually, it's not a bad plan." The great black form of Hugin appeared in the air in front of them and landed at Brady's feet. "Ragnarok," he croaked. "Hugin!" exclaimed Brady as the bird walked in his gunslinger crouch, assessing the situation. He sauntered over to the chains and began testing them with his beak, fiddling with them, manipulating and testing them. After a few moments, he waddled back to Brady and cawed again, "Ragnarok!" "Yeah, I know," Brady said. "Hugin, buddy, you gotta find Kaylee and Joe. Tell them not to come here." "Well, how's he gonna do that?" questioned Ben. "Can they understand the Raven as you can?" "No," said Brady in exasperation. He knew in his heart that Kaylee and Joe would seek him out, and that Grendel would be watching for them. He might even be luring them into his trap at this moment, and there was no way to get a message to them. Perhaps there is a way," Ben ventured. "There's always an alternative, Brady." "There is? Well, would you mind telling me?" Brady said as he twisted his good arm under the chain. "I'd rather not. If I told you, you might object, and then we'd have to enter into negotiations, and that would simply take up too much time. The time is right for action. The idea I have would mean abandoning you for a while. Hugin would need to take me somewhere." "Where?" "No time for explanations, Brady. Time is of the essence. Hugin, can you hear me?" called the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. "Ragnarok," replied the bird. Brady wasn't at all surprised that the bird in the book could communicate. "Come on, over here, in this trouser pocket. Just lift the flap and take me." Hugin walked over to Brady and deftly placed his beak under the flap and lifted it. And then, fishing within the pocket, he withdrew the old paperback, held it firmly in his beak, and took to the air. In a moment, they were both gone, leaving Brady alone with his anger, pain, and worry. Kaylee walked carefully through the darkened hallways of the hospital, moving ever downward toward the lowest level. They'd arrived there this morning just after sunrise, entering through the very door through which she and Brady had fled from Grendel on the night the city had been consumed by the fire. Joe had insisted on following her in, but said he would wait in the main entrance hall. "There's a pharmacy storeroom in the basement. They've got a cold room and a freezer room." "How do you know this?" asked Joe. "I lived in this place for a month, remember? I used to crawl through the ductwork and service tunnels to get around, looking for a way out." He looked at her like a father might scrutinize a wayward daughter. "Please be careful." "I will," she said, "and I'll find some good viable insulin. I'll fix you right up." "I know you will," he said firmly. He hoped she hadn't heard the lingering doubt in his voice. Now that he had purpose, living was something he planned on continuing, at least until the boy and girl were safe. She'd taken a walkie-talkie and given the other to Joe so they could remain in touch, and now, as she slowly sought her way through the labyrinth left by the confusion and madness of the final days of the pandemic, Joe busied himself by investigating the remains of the papers left by the Centers for Disease Control. There was so much clutter and catastrophe in this room, and he still had many unanswered questions. Piles of papers lay strewn on the floor, laptops hurled against the wall, monitors staring blankly at him. No doubt the work of an angry Grendel. What had transpired during the final days of humanity in this last of strongholds he did not know. What efforts were expended, he wondered, to save the species? How had the disease beaten the vital mind of Homo sapiens? What final domino fell to exacerbate the fall of all the others? As he searched, he began to stitch together a loose idea of what had transpired before the end. There was a table in the rear with a sign clipped on a pole that read, "Incident Reports." The pile of papers spiraled out on the floor. Joe began to pick up the incident reports, one after the other, studying them carefully. The story they told was one of almost superhuman effort and focus. The CDC team from Atlanta had been in Washington, and when it had become clear they'd lost the battle in that city, they moved north to Princeton, New Jersey. Again they moved, first to Boston, and finally to Bangor, last bastion of hope. One by one, the nation's cities succumbed to the plague, devastating entire metropolitan areas. Each move took more effort as their numbers diminished. From what he could deduce, Joe saw the same story had been told over and over again. First, there were mass deaths of birds reported from the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Tens of thousands of birds, entire flocks, died in flight. Then humans began to succumb to the illness. The first cases presented themselves to local doctors' offices and hospital emergency rooms, and within 72 hours, entire populations, even shut-ins, were infected. It was the most virulent, contagious agent ever seen by the investigators. The virus caused a massive immune response from the body, turning it against itself. In the end, it was the body, and not the virus, that finally caused death, or so the reports speculated. City after city fell. After the federal government released its powers to local authorities, it became clear that the end was very near, because there were no real local authorities left to take charge. Joe mused that everything came to Maine last, because Maine was the end of the line. The virus chose this place as North America's final battleground. Within 72 hours, anyone who caught it was dead, except for Brady, Kaylee, Dr. Grindle, and for some strange reason, him. Kaylee called on the radio. "Joe, I found some. It's still cool enough down here. I think the insulin's good." He breathed a sigh of relief. "How much did you find?" "I think at least a 3-month supply if we can keep it cool." "The Life Seeker has a propane refrigerator," he replied. I'm on my way. I'll be back up there in a few minutes. Any sign of Grendel?" Joe looked around warily and replied, "No, nothing yet." He arose from the floor slowly, with a great deal of effort, his knees stabbing at his mind with knives of pain. He was almost done here. That was when his eyes were drawn to a photograph on the floor along with a printed sheet of paper. They were well worn and dog-eared, looking like some animal had been handling them. Strange, he thought. After he read the writing, he spent a long moment studying the faces in the photograph. When Kaylee returned from her mission with a cooler full of insulin and syringes, a blood glucose monitor and other supplies, he showed her the letter with the photograph. "What's this?" she asked. "Here," he said, offering it to her. "Yeah, but what is it?" she asked. "It's a printed email," he replied. She set the cooler down upon a desk, took the paper, and began to read aloud. "Dear Peter, I know how swamped with work you must be, so I'll keep this brief. Things here are bad. The power and the net are spotty, and it won't be long before the internet fails. The end has come, and that is that. I'm so sorry that things didn't work out, but I don't want you to go on blaming yourself for what's happened. It isn't your fault. No one could have foreseen the consequences of our actions. We had the best of intentions, and the plan should have worked. I mean, imagine immunizing whole populations of people at a time through an airborne inhalant. We could have saved millions of lives and stopped so much suffering. All of the trials were successful. We never would have received permission from the CDC if our work hadn't been rock solid. The ramifications of our work would have earned us both a Nobel Prize, I'm certain. To immunize entire populations nearly at once from a myriad of diseases, our life's work, and I stand by it, even now. Whatever happened, it wasn't our fault. All I can say is that I suspect involvement from other sources that would put our technology to other deadly use, evil use. And I don't know how to tell you this, except to come right out and say it. Our boy is dead. It happened last night. Complications from the virus. Our little Phil is gone, honey. He's not suffering anymore, and I don't expect that I'll be far behind him. We'll both be waiting for you there in a little while. I just wanted to tell you that I'm not afraid. It's the way of things. It's not anybody's fault. It just is. I accept that. And I just wanted you to know that we both love you more than words can say. You're still everyone's greatest hope. The survivors of this pandemic, and there will be some, will remember that you worked until the very end to find a way to stop it. I know you well enough to understand that you would never give up. Find the answers. And if you survive this, do not regret. Instead, remember us. I love you, always. Diana. The email had an electronic signature, but they both had already read the name of the addressee. Diana Grindle, Research Assistant, Airborne Inoculation Program, CDC. "Dr. Grindle's wife," said Kaylee. "And son," said Joe, handing her the photograph. They seemed to both understand at that moment that there might be something deep down in the darkness of the monster known as Grendel that could be saved. There was a husband and a father in there, a good man who meant to save the world. Brady was parched beyond any thirst he had ever known. Time slowed for him as the sun beat down inexorably from the high heavens, the temperature rising quickly. He ceased to struggle at mid-morning, and by noon he was only barely conscious. His shoulders ached like someone had driven a knife between them. His body was chained in the shape of an X, a position that elicited nothing but torment as the minutes turned to hours, and his mind swam in delirium. He remembered the events of the past few hours only vaguely. Kaylee and Joe thankfully still hadn't arrived. He dreaded their arrival as a harbinger of their own doom, unwittingly falling into Grendel's clutches. And then again, how would they know where to look unless Grendel had given them the proper clues to lead them here? Bjorn was wounded, having limped off into the forest after Fenris left him fallen in the grass to lavish his attention on Brady. Rocinante was dead, a twisted heap of metal off in the forest path. The autobiography of Benjamin Franklin had told him of some sort of plan, but what good could a book possibly do? I mean, he was only a book, after all, and there was nobody to read it, Brady thought. Hugin was gone, to do the book's bidding, whatever that might be. Of course, there was nothing else to do but think, and he imagined that this was part of the torment that Grendel had planned. There was no worse torture than to leave him alone with his thoughts. Brady wondered if he had survived the worst pandemic in the history of his species, only to be destroyed by a monster. Who is he, really? He asked himself. Was Grendel the Antichrist, as described in the Bible? Was he some sort of dark lord, like Sauron from the Lord of the Rings? Was he the devil himself, finally walking the empty earth, claiming his domain? He wasn't human, was he, underneath it all? The monster wanted no humans remaining. His hatred was complete. Brady wondered who else but a human could hate other humans so well. As Apollo's fiery chariot began its downward ascent from the heavens into the west, Brady's mind swam in thoughts, slowly moving from one memory and possibly to the next. Time was viscous and thick, slowly dripping away. Someone was standing next to him, a hooded creature in a black Holocaust cloak. Death stood beside him, like a black-robed and hooded reaper, and waited patiently. Brady looked over at him, and the grinning skull merely nodded in return. He was patient. There was no hurry. Death, it seemed, had all the time in the world. He must be tired after all he's had to do recently, thought Brady. And he thought of his mother, of his friends, of Max, and especially of Kaylee and Joe. And then he thought of Grendel, his nemesis, and despaired. As he looked death in the face, he caught sight of a human face, a handsome man in his early 40s. To Brady, he even thought he looked a little like... Could it be? Did death look like Kaylee? The monster would return shortly, and Brady had no weapon other than his words and his will. Any other boy might have despaired as though he was as helpless as a baby, but Brady knew that words were also weapons, used wisely. As long as he had his senses, he was not totally unarmed. Twilight began to fall as the air began to cool mercifully. Brady's head nodded, his chin resting on his chest, his mouth dry cotton. Swallowing was sandpaper scraping against stone, rough and pointless. Yet even in his quiet, painful state of suffering, he noticed a change in the atmosphere, a subtle shift among things. He heard sounds. Was that Grendel and the were-dogs come to witness his end? No, he thought, slowly lifting his head and opening salt-caked eyes. It was something else. Coming into focus as the sun had all but vanished from the sky, leaving purple and red bands around the edge of the horizon, and a color that had no name, was a nearly transparent form of a little boy, the orphan with the red ball he had seen before. He stood a few feet from Brady and gazed at him, saying nothing. He seemed to wait in a place between the worlds, in a time apart from time. He was the ghost of the orphan boy Brady had met weeks ago, the only shade in Mount Hope who had interacted with him. Now the boy moved his lips, but the sound produced from this ethereal child did not come at the moment of utterance. There was a time delay and reverberation that indicated vast distances and long pathways to reach him. Brady heard the boy ask, "Why are you here like this? We would like to know." Barely able to speak, Brady muttered in response, "I've been captured by the monster. He's using me to draw other survivors here so he can kill us all." The boy moved closer to look into Brady's bloodshot and tired eyes. "You're not dead, but I can see you. We can see you. How come?" "We?" asked Brady through dry lips. He raised his head again, and in the twilight he could see amassing around him in a vast semicircle the shapes of the ghost of Mount Hope. They stood in lines, one behind the other, all dressed in the funeral attire they wore when they were laid to rest. When he had first glimpsed this shadow world weeks ago, most of the shades he saw were happy, pleased to be meeting each other again, pleased to have arisen. Now they were a solemn assemblage, a Greek chorus standing to the side, watching the suffering of the hero and sharing it in silence. They seemed to sense that this was a critical moment in the world, and though none but the boy spoke, he knew they could all hear him. "Am I going to join you? Are you my welcoming committee?" Brady asked, half smiling through the pain. The boy said, "We don't know. We've been waiting to move on, but we just stay here. We hope there's more to come, but for now, we've come to stand beside you." For the first time in hours, Brady's mind ignited like the smallest of flames in the darkness. Had the boy said they'd come to stand beside him? "I don't understand," Brady said. The shade of an elderly professorial man came forth from the silent throng and knelt one knee to the ground, whispering to the boy gently. The boy nodded to the professor and then relayed the words to Brady. "We're only watchers. We can't act to help you. The only thing we can do is stand beside you. The only thing we can do to help you is stand by you, so that you aren't alone. No matter what happens, you're not alone. You're never alone." Brady surveyed the shadows, phantoms, and shades of the departed that surrounded him. They were a strange mixture of time and place, but all of them looked back at him with eyes boring into his mind, some nodding, some smiling, some looking at him with grave concern. How odd, Brady wondered. "Am I going to die?" Brady asked. "Someday," said the boy. "Everybody dies. I mean, everybody. Everything. That's just the way it works." Brady rephrased his question. "Am I going to die tonight?" The boy seemed puzzled, but the professorial gentleman knelt next to him again and whispered something into his ear. And then he responded to Brady, "We don't know, because time is gone from us. You are in the river of time, where only the living can dwell. We don't want you to die. If we could, we'd help you beat your monster. We can only watch. You have to fight him alone. Our days of doing are done. Only your actions can change the way of things. Ours can't. So we'll stand by you, so that you won't be alone." Brady understood. They felt concern for him, both in this world and the next. He repeated the boy's words aloud, causing a smile to come to the boy's face. "My actions can change the way of things. I can still make a difference." A ripple, like a wave of understanding, fanned out through the throng of the watchers. Their demeanor changed. Though he could only hear the little orphan boy, he knew that their changed aspect was a message received in their collective mind. Don't give up, no matter the pain or the cost. Though you die 1,000 deaths, never give in, never give up, never ease up on your throttle. It's always darkest before the dawn. As the last light of the setting sun shot like a spectral sword from the west, darkness fell, and the stars began to come out one by one. The moon was full, and the shades all began to fade and then disappear from his eyes. Brady's head sank onto his chest once more in pain, but not entirely in despair. The next time Brady raised his head, it was because he felt the lash of a whip's tip against his chest, snapping and ripping at his flesh. His head jerked upright, and the back of his skull slammed against the stone of the tower. Opening his eyes, suddenly wide awake, he saw something nightmarish and unnatural. Fenris, the alpha were-dog, was standing in front of him, and in his hand was a long rawhide whip. Then realization came thundering into his mind. His hand? The were-dog no longer had a paw. In its place was a human hand, complete with opposable thumb, holding the whip. When the were-dog saw the look on Brady's face, he snarled, curling his lip, and let go another snap. The tip of the whip carved a gash in Brady's left cheek, the blood flowing in a line punctuated by minuscule red drops. "Awake now, boy. Did you get enough sleep?" asked the were-dog. Around the stone tower in the darkness sat a mass of were-dogs, and at Fenris's words they barked and howled their pleasure. Fenris seemed more human than dog now, but the others were still more canine in their frames. "He wants you to awake, my master does," continued Fenris. "You know what's sad?" asked Brady of Fenris. "You probably used to be a good dog. I bet some little boy or girl really loved you, took you on walks, played with you in the park. I bet you fetched balls and caught frisbees. You peed on fire hydrants and pooped on the floor, and that was okay 'cause you were cute. I bet you even stuck your head out of the window when your owners took you for a drive in the car. But look at you now. Sad, really. You're nothing but a bad dog." The were-dog snarled and let 3 lashes of the whip fall haphazardly across Brady's body. Brady lurched as much as he could under the bondage of the chains, but he didn't let the were-dog have the satisfaction of a cry in the night. Instead, Brady laughed. "I was never a dog. I am a man. I've always been man," the were-dog insisted. "A man? You were never a man. You're just man's best friend," said Brady, sarcasm clearly flowing in his voice. "No," shouted Fenris, but then his shout turned into a wolf-like howl, the ancient call of the wild through the nights of the world, and when he heard that, the were-dog stopped altogether, embarrassed by his own betraying utterance. "See? It's no shame. Better a good dog than a bad man, wouldn't you say?" asked Brady. But the alpha were-dog could not reply because there was a disturbance in the throng of were-dogs behind him, and they parted like the Red Sea, as from their midst came the form of Grendel, emerging from the darkness. Brady heard his stomping and felt the ground shiver and quake before the form of the monster emerged. He was larger than ever. He towered over them, and they drew back, many of them whining as they slid away from the sheer force of his presence. And Brady thought, dragon, Nidhogger, Ymir, Balrog, Cthulhu, Mephistopheles. And even though the only light that shone down upon them was that from the moon and the stars, Brady could easily discern the beast. He had never had the time to truly look at him before, but now he found himself calmly examining his adversary. How strange, he thought, that I can turn on my observation mood even now, at the end of things. Though he wore no clothing, he was obviously neither male nor female, but something that reproduced in some other manner. Muscles rippled from legs and thickness of cinder blocks. A massive chest the size of several men expanded to gargantuan proportions, and reminded Brady of all things of the trolls from Tolkien's The Hobbit, or the giants that Don Quixote fought that turned out to be only windmills. He was at least 16 feet tall, with arms like stone columns and hands like Thor's hammer. The blades that thrust out from the spine of his back were larger now, saurian in their appearance. A monstrous humanoid creature stood there, as though in mockery of the human form, a walking cartoon of malice, taking the form of that which it sought to destroy. Still, Brady couldn't capture an image from the continuously changing putty of Grendel's face. Instead of one face, there were tens, hundreds, thousands. He walked ponderously like a great pendulum or battering ram, and when he spoke it sounded like the sinking of great ships into the deep, or the thundering toppling of tall buildings suddenly into the ground. He was malevolence incarnate, and though his unnatural form seemed unstoppable, Brady made a decision. No matter the pain, the torment, or the likely outcome of the struggle, he would not give in. "Pay attention," he told himself. What was that? Brady asked himself, imagination? Everything I imagined evil to be? His musings were cut short by the words of the monster. "Renamer, I have you at last," laughed Grendel. "How's it feel to know you have failed?" Brady looked up, and beyond all hope of rescue or protection, smiled a crooked wry grin, and said in a relaxed voice, "Talk, talk, talk. It's all you ever do. I think you like the sound of your own voice." The bite of the whip found a purchase on Brady's abdomen, and he winced, yet he didn't scream. Again he raised his head in defiance and gave a single relaxed laugh. Grendel walked to within a foot of Brady and said in a low tone, "I can kill you any time I wish. I can with a single deed. I can be the cause of your prolonged and painful death, and yet you mock me?" "Yeah, you're beginning to understand. I'm not afraid of you," Brady said simply. "You might be able to hurt me, kill me even, But I'm not afraid of you. Imagination. Brady thought of that word over and over, an echo machine-gunning in his mind. Why was he thinking that word? Why now? The monster's fetid breath was so strong that Brady thought it might even serve to melt human flesh, yet the word imagination ricocheted in his mind like a super ball from a grocery store vending machine. He looked down at his feet, and he could see the outline of the little boy. Neither Grendel nor the weredogs could see him. He could view two worlds at once. They could only see one. The little orphan looked up at Brady, and in his mind Brady heard his voice. "We understand. Monster, you did this. You, he thought. I did? What do you mean, thought Brady to the child. You were so angry when the world fell. You didn't know how powerful you'd become since everyone else passed over to the other side of the river, to the far shore. You were so angry. Brady tried to remember what he was talking about, but he still heard the chanting of the word in his mind, this time not from the whisperers, but from the invisible watchers, the inhabitants of this graveyard. Imagine. What did I do? Asked Brady in his mind, as Grendel tugged at his chains and cursed him with foul epithets. Don't you remember? The boy rose in the air and whispered in Brady's ear, You made him. You imagined him into the world. The scream that woke us from our slumber also called him forth. You did this. End of chapter 24, part 1.